This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt Podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. This was a case that I'm sure some haven't heard of because there were other major events going on at the time. Phil Spector was on trial for the murder of Lana Clarkson, which was very similar to what happened in this case, and forest fires were out of control in Los Angeles. The media focused on these two events and didn't do as much reporting on this case. You're listening to episode 42, Kristin Baldwin. Kristin was born on May 6, 1969, to parents Marie and Rick Arlington. Rick moved Kristin and her two older siblings to many places because of his job. They lived in several cities in New York before the family moved to Massachusetts. Marie and Rick grew apart before Kristin turned 2, and they divorced. Marie got married again to another man with the last name of Baldwin. Side note, Kristin would later on take his last name for reasons that were slightly complicated, and we will circle back to later. They had a daughter together, so Kristin was no longer the youngest child. That marriage didn't make it very far either, and ended in divorce a few years later. Then Marie went to her high school reunion and reconnected with a classmate named Peter Means. Marie and Peter were married when Kristin turned 5. She was the most outgoing and daring of her siblings. Their new father figure, Peter, would get them out on the ski hill since he was an instructor, and the kids would ski for free. Kristin was a child that skied the slopes without trepidation or fear. Peter adopted Marie's kids, and they all took his last name, Means. Peter took a job in Westlake Village, California, and the entire family moved cross-country. By the time the kids were high school aged, Peter and Marie divorced. He lived close enough where he could see the kids often, and he maintained his role of father, despite the divorce. Kristin wanted to be in movies, and was likely influenced by movie stars she saw in her daily life, living so close to Malibu. She graduated high school in 1987 and moved to Newport Beach with a few friends, where she took college classes and paid bills by waiting tables. Kristin dropped out of college a year and a half in. She followed her older brother to Hawaii and stayed there for a while. Kristin went through several relationships that never worked out, and a few years later moved back to California. She got into a car accident that was her fault. The legal advice she received advised her to change her last name to avoid losing her license. Kristin changed her last name to Baldwin. It had nothing to do with her stepfather, Peter Means, whom she loved. In California, Kristin met a man named David Mahler through their mutual friend, Michael Conacetti. David was the oldest of 3 kids who grew up in a well-to-do family in Long Island. And later, the family moved to New Jersey. His father was a Wall Street type who traded commodities. David attended Fairfield University in Connecticut. He then went to law school at New York University in Greenwich Village. After passing the bar exam, David immediately launched his private law practice. He handled divorce cases and civil suits, but then moved into defending narcotics and prostitution cases. David practiced law both in New York and New Jersey. David was dating a woman in California and moved there after some alleged problems with corrupt clients he had associated with on the East Coast. He failed the bar test in California 2 times and became a commodities trader who also offered legal advice. Mahler would never work as a practicing lawyer again, and on September 17, 1998, a court formally ordered that he was suspended from practicing law for failure to comply with attorney registration requirements. Porn actor Michael Conacetti, whom was better known as Damian Michaels in his films, was arrested on a drug charge. A friend hooked him up with David, who could not defend him, but gave him legal advice. the two became fast friends. Michael Conoscetti met Kristin when she was serving tables in a restaurant. She had car issues, and he knew someone who could help her. They eventually formed a friendship and would often hang out. In September 2006, Kristin was in Calabasas, visiting Conoscetti, when David Mahler showed up, and this was how the pair met. David's drug use was ramping up around this time. Kristin either didn't know to what extent he used, or she didn't mind his relationship with hard drugs. He was also seeing several other women. According to David, he and Kristin didn't really have a relationship. He claimed to not know her very well. But if you ask people who knew them, there was some level of relationship present. Dale Perlman met up with David Mahler on May 23, 2007 in Newport Beach, California. The pair had a business relationship, but they were hanging out late that evening. Mahler also had invited Kristin along for the trip. Perlman invited the pair to stay at the Island Hotel, so David and Kristin followed Perlman there. They checked into the hotel early on May 24, 2007. Perlman and Mahler spoke on the phone a few times that day. Mahler was all over the place. He loved Kristin, and then he hated Kristin. He told Perlman that, "We've got to get that bitch out of here. I don't want to pay for a cab or limo." Perlman assumed that Mahler and Kristin must have been fighting. On May 25, 2007, David Mahler checked out of the hotel. He told the hotel staff he was leaving Kristin in the room, and he would not be paying for her. Hotel staff found her crying in the room because she was stranded, since Mahler was her only transportation. Later that night, Kristin left the hotel and took an expensive cab ride home. She called Mahler and went to see him, perhaps to talk about the money she spent on the cab ride. Mahler owned a large multi-level pink stucco home on the 8500 block of Coalcrest Drive in the Hollywood Hills. He rented a few of the studios contained within the home to a few different people. Donald Van de Velde was one of those tenants. He had been a rock star who never really made it. Donald had gotten into drugs and money had been tight. He often did tasks for Mahler for a little extra money. And just as often, Mahler wouldn't pay up. On May 27, 2007, Donald approached Mahler to collect money for minor jobs he had performed. Mahler was not there, but Kristin was home, and she let Donald in. Kristin was using crystal meth and offered Donald a line. When Mahler returned home, he was upset at a person named Rick, and he was upset at Kristin too. He asked Donald Van de Velde to leave because he needed to talk with Kristin. Naturally, Donald thought that their discussion had to do with this Rick person. Donald left, but shortly after, Mahler asked him to return. Donald saw Kristin looking through her bags, while Mahler was walking around the room like a lunatic with no clothes on, other than an open bathrobe that he had swiped from the hotel, and he wasn't speaking coherently. This wasn't the first time Donald had seen Mahler in this state, but it was more intense than in the past. Mahler had been using a lot of drugs, cocaine, meth, Xanax, and alcohol, and was quickly spiraling out of control. Mahler walked over and pulled out a gun that was tucked away. He was screaming and waving the gun around the room. Mahler pointed it at Kristin and then at Donald. He lunged at Kristin and pulled the trigger a few times. The gun dry-fired, as it had not been loaded with ammunition. Donald tried to calm Mahler down. As best Donald could discern, Mahler thought someone was setting him up, and now had a bullet in his hand. He loaded the gun and spun the cylinder around. Mahler pointed the gun near Donald and pulled the trigger. His emotions fluctuated between anger and calm, then between friendliness and hostility. The 13 Xanax Mahler consumed weren't helping his cause. When Mahler was composed, he laid on the bed with his gun in hand, and when his emotions ramped up, he was frantically pacing around the room. Donald picked up the gun during a moment of Mahler's inattention. Donnie was hoping he could toss the weapon off the balcony, but Mahler's eyes were on him. He grabbed the gun back from Donald, then set it down. Next, Mahler tried to orchestrate a threesome between Kristin, Donald, and himself. Donald felt the worst behavior had passed, and Mahler had settled down, so he left the room. As Donald closed the door, he heard the gunfire. He retreated to his apartment, not wanting to be involved. Another one of Mahler's tenants, Johann Langley, was sipping on alcohol when he heard loud screaming coming from Mahler's bedroom. One minute there would be silence, and the next minute there would be yelling. Johann thought Mahler was being threatening. All the profane language and screaming were being directed at a woman. The cycles of chaos and calamity went on from 2:30 a.m. or so until 6 a.m. That was when Johann heard a female let loose a few terrified screams. Then he heard a loud sound, like movers dropping a piece of furniture on the floor. Shortly after, it sounded like something was being dragged around, and this was followed by a loud thump. Mahler banged on Johann's door and said he had an emergency on his hands. He needed to get rid of a dead body. By Johann's estimation, Mahler was on drugs. He was shaking with dilated pupils and had a stiff jaw. His skin was so pasty, it looked like it hadn't seen the sun in years. Johann went over to Mahler's room and peered inside. From a distance, he saw a slender blonde woman laying on the floor. Her hair was tousled, and there was blood dripping out of a small bullet hole entrance in the left cheek of her face. Mahler then divulged he shot her on the balcony. Johann turned around, went back to his room, and locked the door. He refused to help, but he also didn't call the police. Donald van de Velde's phone rang incessantly. The caller ID said it was Mahler, so Donald wasn't interested in picking up the phone. Eventually, the ringing wore Donald down, so he relented and picked up the receiver. Mahler wanted Donald to stop back up and collect his money. This was a calculated way to get Donald's attention, since he was suffering through hard financial times. Mahler proceeded to tell Donald that he was not at the house at the moment. Even when he was high on drugs, he still operated from a defense lawyer's point of view. Mahler broke into a story about the incident, and he wanted to make it clear that he had acted in self-defense because she came at him with a knife. Mahler said he went somewhere to be protected, and it cost him $350,000. Donald wasn't buying any of this, but he attempted to buzz into Mahler's part of the house. No one let him in. When he looked in the garage, one of Mahler's 2 Jaguars was gone. Donald decided to break into Mahler's side of the house, so he crawled in through the garage window. In Mahler's room, he saw a few fingers that dangled out from a figure that was wrapped in a bedspread. Donald was terrified and retreated to his apartment. On the way back, Donald stopped to speak with Johann. They talked about what they both witnessed, but at that time, neither man dialed the police. Johann left his apartment to hide out for a few days, as he was shaken from what had happened. A neighbor's surveillance camera collected footage of Mahler's blue Jaguar pulling out of his garage and confirmed his departure happened at 6:21 a.m. on May 27, 2007. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. Thank you to Best Fiends for sponsoring this episode of Beyond Contempt True Crime. Podcast listeners, let me tell you about Best Fiends. It's an engaging puzzle game that everyone is playing. It's a match 3 game that you play on your phone. Best Fiends keeps adding new levels and events all the time, so the game is always fresh and exciting. It's a great game to play when I need to take a break from watching true crime documentaries. That Hulu True Crime channel can really suck you in. And you don't even need to be tethered to Wi-Fi because you can play it without an internet connection, which is great for me because my internet provider sometimes drops the ball, like a lot. Trust me, you really don't want to miss out on this game. Join me and the millions of people who are already playing this fun puzzle game. Download Best Fiends free in the Apple App Store or on Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. Now, back to the show. David Mahler called Carlton Noble on that morning. They met at the Marriott Hotel by LA International. Mahler checked into his room before 7 a.m. and told the staff that anyone who called or inquired about him was not to be told that he was a registered hotel guest. Mahler told Carlton that he got into a scrap with a woman, the gun discharged, and she was deceased. He wanted help getting rid of the body. Carlton Noble did not believe Mahler, so Mahler asked him to name his price. Carlton said that there was no amount of money for which he would participate in something like that. Carlton Noble was the person who provided Mahler with sex workers in the past, and that day was no different. The discussion of murder was fleeting, as Carlton, Mahler, and a sex worker partied hard in the hotel room. The party was winding down, and the sex worker asked Mahler for the money that he owed her. Instead of paying up, he leapt off the bed, tripped over a cocktail table, and in the process knocked over and destroyed a TV. He quickly became agitated and refused to pay up. When Mahler checked out of the hotel on May 28, 2007, his bill was $3,700. $400 was for room service, and the rest was for damage from partying and trashing the room. Mahler drove back to his home, and his neighbor's surveillance camera showed his blue Jaguar returning to his garage at 12:34 p.m. Just a few minutes later, his other Jaguar backed out of the garage, circled around the driveway, and backed into his spot in the garage. The camera recorded Mahler leaving and returning to his garage over the next several days. Later on in court, it was revealed that Mahler went to see his friend, Michael Conoscetti, and asked if he knew anyone who could dispose of a body. Michael thought Mahler was in a daze and, of course, declined to help. On June 1, 2007, finally Johann Langley's conscience overcame his fear of Mahler, and he dialed 911 to report the shooting that took place on the morning of May 27th. Jeremy Moody was another one of Mahler's tenants, and Mahler was now at his front door. The police were there, and he needed to cut through Jeremy's room so he could escape out the side door. Jeremy didn't let him through and let the police into Mahler's home. Authorities arrested Mahler after they found him hiding in a closet. Mahler's excuse for hiding was some of his clients wanted to harm him, and he feared for his life. They arrested him on the suspicion that he committed murder. Investigators conducted several interviews with Mahler's tenants and estimated that a woman had been killed 5 days prior. No one reported it to law enforcement because they all feared an erratic David Mahler. The body was missing, but they found blood in the garage, on a car in the garage, on the stairs, in the main bedroom, and on a white bathrobe. In the bedroom, the perpetrator made a feeble attempt to clean up the crime scene with sponges and cleaning products. The results from this half-hearted effort were red fibers left in the sink and red-tinted stains on the carpet. The stair steps were tinged with blood, as if a body had been dragged down the stairs. On June 1, 2007, detectives sat down to interview David Mahler. He admitted he had been with Kristin Baldwin on May 27th. When he last saw Kristin, she was alive because he claimed that there was movement and she was verbal. Given that Mahler was a lawyer, he attempted to cut a deal with investigators. He wanted his bail hearing that same day, and he wanted it set at a reasonable amount. Mahler insinuated if his bail hearing had to wait, then Kristin wouldn't have a chance of being found alive. He claimed that Kristin Baldwin could be found at the intersection of I-15 North above Barstow and I-40 near a hospital sign. Mahler declared that she was not hidden, and it was almost like he had dropped her off right in front of a hospital. Unsurprisingly, the body was not found at that location, and Kristin Baldwin didn't talk to many people on a regular basis, so no one reported her missing. On June 16, 2007, a motorist was stranded 4 miles east of Barstow in San Bernardino County. 2 kind-hearted Marines pulled over to help with the stuck car. Something shiny caught their eye, and that was when they spotted a body in a drainage ditch. The body was decomposed and mummified. It was in such poor condition that a special fingerprint technique was used, and results came back positive for Kristin Baldwin. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was a gunshot to the torso. However, the evidence was somewhat sparse, and the murder weapon was never recovered. There were not any bullet holes in the side of her face, as was claimed by one of Mahler's tenants. They found fragments from the bullet in her backbone. The medical examiner found a hole on the right side of her nose. This hole was significantly larger than the one on the back of her neck, and there was also a hole on the right side of her chest. Because of the terrible condition of the body, the pathologist could not determine if the hole on the right side of her nose was a bullet hole or a defect. They tried to match DNA from the body to blood found in Mahler's home. The DNA was too decomposed to get a match, so law enforcement used a sample from Kristin's mother, Marie. The DNA came back as a 99.26% probability that the person killed in Mahler's home was 38-year-old Kristin Baldwin. They charged David Mahler with Kristin Baldwin's murder, and he also received a charge for the assault of Donald van de Velde with a firearm. The trial started in August 2009. Mahler's court-appointed psychiatrist believed he was bipolar, and he had cognitive defects because of his chronic drug use, especially from his dependence on cocaine. The doctor explained that some of Mahler's behavior, as described by his tenants, fit the pattern of a bipolar individual experiencing mania. This was not so much of a justification as it was an explanation. Mahler wasn't speaking in full sentences, and his verbal stream was more like a word salad, with punctuated screaming and rage. He had used drugs since he was 17 years old, and was hospitalized in a psychiatric facility that same year. Mahler knew his tenant, Donald, wanted methamphetamines, and he knew Kristin had methamphetamines. When Mahler asked her how much of the drug she had, she repeatedly didn't respond, which irritated him. Mahler broke off from reality and picked up the gun to scare her into answering his question. The psychiatrist said that Mahler didn't remember what happened next, but that the gun went off. After the shooting, Mahler's checking into the hotel, buying services from a sex worker, using drugs, and trashing the room were all part of the mania episode. On September 14, 2009, the jury deliberated for about a day before they found 45-year-old David Mahler guilty of the second-degree murder of Kristin Baldwin, and he was also guilty of the assault of Donald van de Velde with a firearm. The outcome of his verdict had to be relayed to him because he refused to leave his cell on that day to attend court. On October 9, 2009, they sentenced David Mahler to 40 years to life. 15 years to life was for the murder itself, and additionally 25 years to life was an enhancement for the use of a firearm. Then a 3-year sentence for the gun assault ran concurrently. Mahler appealed his case on a technicality that the judge improperly instructed the jury on the definition of second-degree murder. This violated a 1969 California Supreme Court case of the People v. Ireland. The medical examiner couldn't firmly establish that Mahler shot Kristin in the face as opposed to the torso, and this did not establish the malice element required to meet the definition of second-degree murder. In September 2011, a state appellate court agreed and reversed his conviction. In March 2012, instead of going to trial, Mahler pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, which was a 2-decade sentence. He may have opted for this as opposed to risking a capital murder trial. Mahler told the judge that a man really shouldn't be defined by his worst moment of his life. He claimed to be remorseful and wanted to positively contribute to society, even though his arrogant actions at his original criminal trial painted a different picture of his character. Kristin Baldwin was cremated, and her family brought her boxed remains to Mahler's sentencing hearing. They fondly reminisced that Kristin would throw up a Hawaii Hang 10 sign with her hand because she enjoyed her time living there. Eventually, her family brought a portion of her remains to Hawaii and spread them in the rolling waves of the ocean. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for the links to the sources and the music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and music scoring were performed by me. Renee. Thank you to new patrons, Julie F. and Tim H. Your merch is in the mail, and I appreciate your support. If you like the show, please leave me a positive review in Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.